Hello, my friends, and happy Easter. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. I admit that it feels a little awkward shouting that out all by myself in here. In fact, if we can be real for a moment, Easter itself can feel awkward for some of us. We know that we're supposed to feel joyful and show it by dressing up in fancy clothes and smiling at everybody we see because Christ is risen. But even on Easter, that may feel a little fake. Getting up this morning, instead of humming Easter hymns, maybe you groaned at the prospect of facing another day. Facing days has been harder recently because our world feels a bit darker recently. People are arguing over everything. The economy is crashing, the climate is changing, racial and political tensions are rising, as are rates of school shootings, depression, anxiety, and suicide, not to mention the growing specter of war. What's worse, we've lost confidence in the institutions and leaders who are supposed to rescue us from these messes. Washington, Wall Street, and higher ed take our dreams, but leave us with debt. Instead of connecting us to each other, the algorithms on social media further divide us. And traditional media is no better. We no longer trust the science after seeing there can be influenced as much by ideology as by evidence when it comes to COVID policy, climate change, green energy, or gender. Even religious leaders have been exposed as frauds as we read about one scandal after another. Can we trust anyone anymore? And it's not just them. A lot of us have given up on ourselves. Too many failures have proven that we're not as talented or virtuous as we wanted to believe. We're pretty sure that if people really knew us, they wouldn't like us very much. Does some guy rising from the dead 2,000 years ago miraculously fix my finances? Or the challenges I face at work? Does he heal the toxic culture in our politics or the toxic relationship with my spouse? Or help me find a partner in the first place? It's well documented that Christianity is on the decline in Western culture. But instead of being replaced by sunny secular humanism, as experts had predicted, Christianity and civilization itself are actually being replaced by nihilism, a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Nothing matters. No one can be trusted. I might as well have fun where I can, because nothing I do or anyone else does can ever fix the mess that we're in. So why bother trying? This may feel like a new phenomenon, but it's actually a return to an ancient one. We see it even in the Bible, 7 centuries before Jesus arrived. After decades of corruption from their kings and priests, widespread cultural decay created by unchecked self-indulgence, all of which culminated in a crushing military defeat, the people of Israel gave up. The Lord urged them to repent and be renewed, but why bother? Everything we try blows up in our faces. Why sacrifice for others? Would they do that for me? Why hope at all? It only opens you to more disappointment. Just live for the moment and do whatever feels good, because trying is futile. And the future will probably be even worse. So they gave up, declaring despairingly, "Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." Well, that's ancient history, but it sounds surprisingly contemporary, because all the accumulated division, deceit, disappointment in our country, our churches, each other, and ourselves has left us in despair. Nihilism has become the default philosophy of Generation Z, but it influences all of us. We read another tragic headline or have another toxic conversation, and we wonder, why waste energy hoping anymore? Which means, why waste energy trying anymore? We'll lose either way. Why recycle? Because most of it ends up in landfills anyway. Why work hard when I'll always be in debt? Why stand up for justice or truth when it won't make any difference? And I'll probably just get canceled. Why share good news about Jesus? Because no one really cares. Why hold off on sex until marriage when my spouse probably won't have waited for me? Why get married when it'll probably just end up in divorce? Why have kids? Why not just mess them up? And the world will only be worse by the time they grow up. Why try when all the obstacles just seem impossible? Have you ever felt that? Most of us have. I've mentioned before that this is how Michelle and I felt in the early years of our marriage, which were profoundly painful. We argued about everything, and we constantly felt hurt. It's not just that we didn't like each other very much. Our relationship created a mirror that revealed things in both of us that neither of us wanted to see. Everything we tried to make it better, talking about it, not talking about it, spending more time together or less, only made things worse. After a few years, we wondered why we were trying so hard. So much hurt and anger had accumulated. It was like a million small stones blocking a road after a landslide. Every time you pull one away, two more tumble down in its place. It'd be impossible for us to overcome all that. So why bother? We didn't get a divorce, but we gave up. Gave up trying or even hoping anymore. That was so much less painful than to keep dreaming only to keep being disappointed. Well, I guess that got a little dark. Did I ruin the Easter mood? The one day that's supposed to be a distraction from all this darkness? Actually, I think this mood is exactly what makes Easter matter so much. And don't you imagine this is exactly the mood of those women we read about a few moments ago? After generations of foreign occupation, people in Israel had grown accustomed to poverty, oppression, discrimination, and despair. Their military, political, and religious leaders were powerless and corrupt. And God? God was gone, it seemed. Like in the time of Isaiah, centuries earlier, most people had given up even hoping anymore. Until this angel and a baby and a virgin and some magi from the east. Could it be? And then nothing for another 30 years. More empty promises, apparently. Until this rabbi emerged out of nowhere, saying things that no one had ever heard before, and in a way they'd never heard before. More authoritative and spirit-filled. He talked about God like he actually knew him, and as though God were right here, right now, available. I'm not just to the priests, but to everybody. Could it be? And then more rumors started swirling. Unbelievable rumors about miraculous healings and driving out demons. And did you see who he hangs out with? Common folks, like fishermen, outcasts, like lepers, and sinners, like the tax collectors. He included women among his disciples, which was never done, and welcomed children. I mean, it didn't seem like he was just enduring these people. He truly enjoyed them. I mean, loved them even. I mean, as if that could make any sense. And his preaching, the amazing things he said about a new kingdom, a new way of relating to God based on love rather than oppressive laws, that would have been literally unbelievable. Except, how can we ignore all those miracles? I mean, more and more of them. Do you think it could be? I mean, do you think it's possible that God really does care? That God really is here? That this is God saving us? Just a few people at first, but then more and more people started to believe and to hope again. Something they hadn't been able to do in centuries. But maybe they were the generation that would finally see the fulfillment of all those promises that they'd long since given up on. Some of you know from personal experience that after you've been hurt, abandoned, or deeply disappointed by someone, it's not only hard to trust again, it's terrifying. There's a part of you that wants to believe, but there's another self-protective part that keeps screaming that you'd be ridiculous to risk trusting again. You'll just get hurt again, and you're not sure you can endure another blow. That's what the people of Israel must have felt. What Jesus says and does, it's so beautiful that we want to believe, but after so many false promises and false prophets in the past, do we dare trust again? Do we dare, coming out from behind the protective wall of cynicism we hide our hearts behind so they won't get crushed again? Are we fools to believe that God is really here to help us? This, I suspect, is why, despite evidence that looks overwhelming as we read about it, people in Jesus' time were slow to accept the good news, he declared, because they'd been hurt too many times in the past. They didn't want to be tricked again. Some of you watching today are similarly reluctant to trust Jesus, not because you don't want to believe, but because you've been lied to, let down, or taken advantage of, and you're not sure that you can handle that again. Could following Jesus really make a difference? Or will I just end up being disappointed again? But despite all their caution, Jesus' message and miracles were so compelling that not just a few individuals, or even a few thousand, but huge multitudes started to believe. There was so much hope, so much joy that in Jesus, God had finally come to set them free, starting, of course, by defeating the Roman army. Right? I mean, that's the only way to do it. So clearly, that's what Jesus would use his miraculous superpowers to do. That's why, on the day we call Palm Sunday, jubilant crowds lined the streets, cheering and chanting as Jesus rode into Jerusalem for a final showdown with the Romans. They knew they really could believe this time. Victory was assured. And that's why, only a few days later, after Jesus was arrested, ridiculed, and whipped by the Romans, those same crowds were furious. Crucify him! For what crime? For what crime? For the crime of lying to us, of coaxing us to step out from the safety of our cynicism to believe that God was going to save us, that God even cares. Believe that maybe freedom and joy and fullness of life that Jesus kept talking about was actually possible. We knew better. We said it wasn't true. But Jesus, he conned us, convinced us, let our fragile hearts hope again, only to be stomped on all over again. Crucify him, because it was all a lie. For some of those angry Israelites, this deception had lasted a few years. For most of them, it had been far less, months or weeks maybe, but it still cut them to the core. So imagine how Mary must have felt. Now, before we go on, let me say that there is legitimate debate about which Marys were at the tomb Easter morning. Because in a society in which, and this is true, approximately 25% of the women were named Mary, it can be difficult to distinguish them. Some cultures resolve this by connecting children to their fathers, leading to last names like David's son, Johnson, and so on. Many of you know that we've adopted 7 children from the Tutsi tribe, and in their culture, as soon as a woman gives birth, both parents' names are changed to reflect the name of their oldest child. So in that culture, my parents would have been known henceforth as Papa Jeff and Mama Jeff, after the name of my older brother. Ancient Israelite culture was a hybrid of these two approaches. Given the patriarchal culture, women were typically identified according to the man who was responsible to provide for them. A father, at first, followed by a husband, Mary, the wife of Joseph. And if he should die, she'd take the name of their oldest child. So Jesus' mother would have become known as Mary, mother of Jesus. But now, Jesus had been executed. Her son could no longer care for her. And Mark captures her profound loss by changing her name to reflect that of her second oldest child, James. This not only followed the current custom, it emphasized the devastation she felt that morning as she made her way to her son's tomb. And I think it captures the way losses like that can truly feel. It changes us somehow. It affects our very identity and our way of relating to the world. Mary had lost everything. Mary, who thought she'd heard promises from an angel 30 years ago and dared to believe. I'm sure she'd been doubted and snickered about, but as that baby grew in her belly, she knew it was true. Imagine all those years holding on to a hope that most people said was silly. She believed that her son, Jesus, was going to save the entire nation. God had told her so it didn't matter what anyone else said. But finally, in the past few years, her persistence was vindicated as everyone else recognized what she'd known all along. Jesus, her son, was God, coming to save them. After years of shame, suddenly she basked in admiration. So if other people were devastated by Jesus' death and defeat, can you imagine how she must have felt? Her son was murdered. That would have been tragedy enough. But compounding the grief over the loss of her child's life must have been grieving the loss of her own life. She devoted decades to a delusion. Had she ruined her family and friendships for no reason? Had she tricked her own son into believing something that wasn't true? Had she cost him his life? Had God ever been there at all? Or had she been wrong all along? In one awful moment, she lost her son, herself, and apparently God as well. I can't know exactly what Mary was thinking as she made her way to care for her son's corpse that Easter morning. But I can imagine her paralyzing despair when she was struck with one last blow. As suddenly she remembered that she's not going to be able to see Jesus' body. She wonders out loud, not as a question, but as a cry of exasperation and defeat, as she realizes how stupid she'd been. Who'll roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? You see, in that culture, tombs were often caves carved out of walls of rock. In order to close the tomb, a huge stone was carved in the shape of a wheel, which weighed thousands of pounds and was set into a slanted track that would make it easy to roll the stone down into place, but almost impossible to roll back up again. Once people are dead, you're not supposed to go in there again. So usually bodies were anointed with spices before being entombed. But the timing of his death, just before the Sabbath began, prevented that in Jesus' case. And because Pilate was worried about Jesus' body being stolen, his tomb had already been closed up. Making matters worse, Pilate demanded that Jesus' tomb be sealed shut, which entailed nailing iron rods into the tomb walls to ensure that it couldn't be opened. And as if that weren't enough, Pilate also ordered it to be guarded by a fleet of Roman soldiers. There was no way Mary was going to see Jesus. It was hopeless. She was hopeless. Her son had been executed. Her life had been wasted. And God had never been there the way she foolishly believed. And now she can't even grieve properly by caring for the corpse of her dead child. Some of you know what it's like to feel hopeless. Some of you know what it's like when the obstacles are just overwhelming. Even trying just seems stupid. Some of you know how it feels to realize that the God you trusted in disappeared. Feels dead. That's how Michelle and I felt when our marriage seemed to be failing. It's how I can sometimes feel when other tragedies strike. And I can't see any solution. Another huge bill when I'm already underwater. Another failure of a high-profile Christian. Maybe you feel that when you endure another rejection from a potential school or spouse you were excited about. Why do I even try? I suspect that many of us felt that last week. Another school shooting? We threw up our hands in angry despair. Friends, we usually feel so alone in those moments. But you need to know that if you're feeling despair today, or just numb, you're not alone. We've all felt that way at some points. And a number of you watching are feeling that way right now. Maybe you don't feel like you're in the Easter mood, but this mood, this hopelessness, is exactly what Easter is all about and why it's so essential. Because despite how it may feel, the overwhelming obstacles in front of you are not impossible to overcome. Because with God, nothing is impossible. You can imagine Mary hearing someone say that first Easter morning, shaking her head with bitterness. Outrage even. Yeah, did you see what they did to my son? Have you seen the size of that stone? That stone is big. But Mary, you can't imagine the strength of our Savior. With God, nothing is impossible. What's remarkable to me is that despite her despair, for some reason, Mary kept walking. We would have understood if she turned back home or just crumpled into a heap on the ground. But despite her despair, despite her disbelief, Mary's deep love for Jesus kept her walking toward that tomb, even though it felt hopeless at that point. And this is where the story shifts unexpectedly. Because as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. But that's impossible. Who? How? What's going on? We moderns patronizingly assume that the ancients were more credulous than we are. But no one expected Jesus to rise back to life that day. Not the disciples, not even Mary. Jesus' own mother believed that was possible. Back then, people didn't ship sick people off to hospitals where they could die out of sight. No, these people watched people die in their streets and in their homes. They'd seen many people die, and they'd never seen anyone come back from death, not once. Death was always a one-way road. Death always triumphed. No one ever escaped it. It was impossible. At one point, Jesus commanded his disciples not to tell anyone what they'd seen until after he'd risen from the dead. But the disciples were baffled. So they kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. It had to be some kind of metaphor, because people in that era didn't believe that people could return from death any more than people in our era do. That's why Mary and the women with her were shocked when they arrived at the tomb. And the mystery only got deeper when they walked inside and found an angel sitting there. They must have been stupefied, but the angel assured them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He's risen from the dead." Mary had missed what Jesus was really doing. She, and the rest of Israel, thought they knew what God rescuing them would look like. Their pain, fear, and anger kept them focused on their immediate challenges, the invading Romans, and for Mary that morning, an immovable rock. They believed that God had failed them because they couldn't imagine that God was actually saving them from something much bigger than what they were worrying about. Despite how it appeared to them on Friday, Jesus' death wasn't a defeat. It was a victory. Jesus not only died in order to forgive our sin, as we celebrated on Friday, Jesus died in order to destroy death from the inside and save us in a way we never dreamed could be possible. In Jesus, God defeated both sin and death so that we can live with him now and forever. The Romans and that rock, were their most immediate problems, and God cared about them, but they were far from their only or even their most important problems. When they thought God was failing them, actually God was saving them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Friends, what problems are you worrying about today? What challenges in your life feel hopeless these days? Overwhelming? Does it involve a relationship, your career, our culture? I see so many Christians these days throwing up their hands in defeat, believing that sin is winning and truth is dying. Jesus seems to be dying all over again. It can feel hopeless. So why bother trying to do good or give generously or speak courageously, share the gospel? Why bother trying to pursue justice or pay the cost of integrity, walk in faith, or hold on to hope when it all just seems pointless? If not for Easter, we'd be right to give up. We'd be right to give in to the nihilism spreading around us and just do whatever feels good. I mean, even Paul admits that the faithless ancients were right. If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But Easter enables us to hope when it seems hopeless. Jesus didn't promise us an easy life. He promised us an eternal life. It means that what we do today, even as if it doesn't seem to matter in the moment, can matter forever. The compassion we show today, the patience we maintain today, the truth we speak today, the love we offer today, the sacrifices we make today, the way we obey God today may not seem to make any difference today. But the God who can feed multitudes out of a few fish and loaves can do more with those faithful choices than we can imagine in ways that may matter for eternity. And they may also make a difference right now. Frustrated by our inability to fix each other, instead of simply walk away, Michelle and I separately decided to follow Jesus by serving each other. You know, love your enemy. And we resolved to fix ourselves. We grew spiritually. We found honest community and accountability. We went to therapy. And God used that to do something that had seemed impossible. God rolled away that rock between us that had seemed immovable. God didn't just heal our marriage the way we'd prayed at first. He healed us in a far deeper way. And that led to the healing of our marriage. We found the same thing in some of the impossible financial challenges or parenting challenges that we faced. Michelle and I are facing some parenting challenges right now that can feel hopeless at times. But like Mary, sometimes we just need to keep walking towards Jesus. Keep serving, keep obeying, keep speaking the truth in love. Even when you've lost all hope, don't give up. Don't go back. Because God may use even your half-hearted obedience to do things that seem impossible to you right now. Therefore, Paul continues, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Hear this today. Easter proves that with God, nothing is impossible. Nothing. I want you to tell God this week, or maybe right now, what challenge or obstacle you think is impossible to overcome. And then watch Jesus smile and say, hold my wine. That may be exactly the place God's been waiting to meet you. Michelle and I gave up on our marriage, that it would ever get better. But we knew, because Jesus proved it by rising back to life that first Easter, that we would live forever. And the way that we treated each other would matter forever. We knew that compared to endless joy for eternity, our current sadness would seem fleeting in retrospect. So both of us, resigned to the fact that our marriage couldn't be saved, that we could never feel genuine affection for each other, resolved to serve Jesus by serving one another, despite the fact that we didn't like it or each other. But we believed that would be something that would matter forever. Maybe a bit like Mary that Easter morning. We felt hopeless, but we kept walking towards Jesus anyway. And maybe a bit like Mary, we were shocked by what God did next because we never expected it. It didn't happen all at once, but over the ensuing years, God healed our marriage and made it a source of unexpected intimacy and joy. But something even bigger was happening in the background, something that we didn't have the eyes to see or the faith to imagine. In the very season that God seemed to have abandoned us, God was actually healing us in ways we didn't even realize we needed. Our marriage wasn't our biggest problem. Our selfishness was. Our immaturity, our reactivity, our self-reliance, our entitlement, our bitterness, our fear, our lack of faith in what God can do. Those were the rocks piled up between us. There was so much in both of us that needed to be healed. And in ways we didn't recognize at the time, God was at work. God was saving us. I don't know what God is going to do with our culture or our climate or how to turn back the tide of depression, division, and violence that seems to be engulfing our society. I don't know what God's going to do about the nihilism that makes people not care. Is there any way to finally defeat poverty, racism, or hatred? It can seem hopeless, but I'm not giving up because Easter proves that nothing is impossible with God. God can roll away any stone, no matter how large it may look. So even when it feels hopeless and pointless, I've learned to keep walking towards Jesus like Mary did that morning. And time again, I find that God is more than able to shove those stones out of the way when it seemed like there was no way. And one day, when death arrives to defeat me, I won't be afraid because I know the one who defeated death and has promised to do the same thing for me. I may die, but I will live forever. And that faith frees me to live more fully right now. I don't need life to be fun, happy, or easy all the time, because I got eternity for that. For now, I may suffer setbacks and face obstacles, but I trust that if I keep following Jesus, He can do more than I could think of to ask for or imagine. How about you? What obstacles feel overwhelming to you these days? Are there places where you have given up? Found it safer to just not care? Stopped hoping so that you won't get hurt? Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's your suffocating loneliness, lust, anger, or anxiety that just seem impossible to overcome. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one that makes the future seem futile. Maybe it's depression that feels debilitating. Maybe it's a sin that you've given up resisting because it's just easier to give in. Maybe it's the division and injustice all around us that seem too big to even bother addressing. I know it can feel impossible, but like Mary that Easter morning, if we can watch God roll boulders right out of the way if we keep walking towards Jesus, even when it feels hopeless, pointless, too late. Because by defeating death itself, Easter proves that with God, nothing is impossible. That's difficult to remember when sin, death, and darkness seem to be winning. Which is why we gather together on Easter morning to remind each other, even in the midst of tragedy, even when God seems dead and we feel dead inside, that if we keep walking towards Jesus, nothing is impossible. Because Christ is risen. He is risen indeed.